Well, thank you everyone for coming to my talk. And thank you so much for inviting me. It is a real pleasure to come here and be able to talk about some of my research and talk about this text, which is an admittedly very obscure text, which not a lot of people read and not a lot of people know about. And what I hope to convince everyone of today is that this is in fact a very cool text that can tell us something about what people in Roman era Egypt believed about their ancient Egypt. The Romans were really, really obsessed with Egypt, and there's some really interesting reasons why. Next, I'll do a quick introduction of this author, this obscure author, Athenaeus, and then we will end the talk with the Deipnosophistae, and I'll talk about what this is, and then we'll look at very specific visions of ancient Egypt in this talk. And I've included this Roman era terracotta wine seal stopper, and we're going to see how this is relevant to the discussion of this text later on. So first, let's talk about Roman era Egypt. So Egypt became a province of Rome in 30 BC after Cleopatra committed suicide in this sort of legendary way that she did with the asp, which is, of course, something that scholars have looked at very critically. And when it became an imperial province, we see the reception of Egypt in the city of Rome. And on his autobiography, Augustus wrote that he added Egypt to the empire of the Roman people. Well, this wasn't quite true. He didn't exactly add Egypt to the empire of the Roman people. And this boils down to the difference between public versus imperial provinces in ancient Rome. So a public province was overseen by the Senate, and it was the senators who effectively were in charge of figuring out who was going to be the governor of this particular province. And the governors were then chosen by lot, and they served for 1 year, and they got this special title called the proconsul title. Now, imperial provinces, starting with Augustus, occupied a different space. It wasn't the Senate who chose the governors of these provinces, but it was the emperor himself. And furthermore, these governors were not given this proconsul title. And even within these provinces, we see that sometimes people from even lower classes, the equites or cavalry class, could be overseeing part of these provinces. And so this is what we have going on with Egypt. However, Egypt was a special imperial province. There were extra steps that were taken. So we have an equites in this province who is specifically in control of legions, which you don't see elsewhere. And we also have senators not allowed to enter Egypt unless they had permission from Augustus. And then, of course, you get Augustus depicted as the pharaoh, like you can see here. In this relief that on this slide. And so the big question is why? Why was Egypt treated in this sort of special way? Well, there are a few reasons for this. Firstly, it was militarily easy to hold in comparison to other Roman provinces. Germany, not so easy to hold. Egypt, a bit easier to hold. And where this became a problem was when you have people with enough military authority to command armies. So the recent history with Mark Antony showed that if you have a general who is in charge of Egypt, he could potentially center all of his power to Alexandria and create this rivalry with Rome. So that is something that Augustus is working with, and he has to shut that down. But in addition to these very important aspects, Egypt was special to Romans for other reasons. And let's go through some of those reasons. Firstly, and this is something that you might have heard of before, Egypt was the so-called breadbasket of Rome. And we hear about this in ancient sources. And while some of these sources might exaggerate the amount of grain that Egypt had to give to the Roman Empire, we do know that the emperor's dole and government personnel were supplied by Egypt. And on top of this, private citizens could import grain from Egypt. And I went ahead and included a nice ear of wheat from the later half of the Ptolemaic era in ancient Egypt. Another reason that Egypt was special to Romans was because of trade. And so there's another ancient text that's also an obscure text that's really fascinating. And it's the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which was written in the 1st century CE, so during Roman era Egypt. And the author in this text travels along this route that you can see on this map. And he's visiting all of these different port cities and going to the markets and seeing all of the different goods that are traded. And so some of the items include semi-precious stones like lapis lazuli. We also get a lot of gold and silver, and some figurines appear as well. We get frankincense and myrrh, and we also get silk from China. So Egypt, for Rome specifically, was an important location for trade. It allowed Romans to get easier access to India and even to China. So a book that I want to also point out is this book, The Triumph and Trade of Egyptian Objects in Rome by Stephanie Pearson. It is a fantastic book, and it looks at how Romans imported and why Romans imported Egyptian objects and what their fascination with these objects was. And one theme that becomes really evident is the theme of abundance and luxury. So Romans were really attracted to this idea of abundance and this idea of luxury. And luxury is defined as gold and ostentation and wealth and things like that. And so the Romans were attracted to this. And that's part of the reason why they became obsessed with Egypt. But with Egypt specifically, and we don't get this for other places in the East, you also have an interest in the archaism. That is an interest in the ancient past of Egypt. And so Romans potentially considered Egyptian art as less foreign than other art because they were relating to this archaism. And in relating to this archaism, they were trying to bring Egypt into their own ancient past. And so in these different ways, we can see Egyptian culture being imported into Rome. So let's take a look at some examples of this. Firstly, we have the monuments, and I specifically wanted to point out a couple of Egyptian obelisks that were moved to Rome. So on the left, we have the Vatican obelisk, which was moved to Rome during the reign of Caligula in 40 CE. Now, it's unknown what pharaoh this obelisk was originally constructed for, but we do know that it was moved to Alexandria by Augustus before Caligula later then moved it to Rome. And we see, sort of bookending the entire Roman Empire, another Egyptian obelisk that was imported into the city. And it is the Lateran obelisk on the right. And it was imported during the reign of Constantius II. And this obelisk we know was constructed under Thutmose III and IV. So we see these huge monuments in the city of Rome, changing the face of the city of Rome and including these Egyptian elements. Nextly, in private villas, we also see Egyptian decorations. And there's a bunch of examples of this, but here's a really fun one from the villa near the Prima Porta. And it's mosaic from 130 to 150 CE, which is a couple of decades before our author Athenaeus was writing. And in it, we see an Egyptian priest giving an offering to Isis, the goddess Isis. And what is really cool about this particular mosaic, and I didn't include enough probably of the surrounding parts, but we have these very Roman motifs around the main scene in the center. So it really is this appreciation and appropriation of Egyptian aesthetic into Roman private spaces. We also have the Pyramid of Cestius, which dates from 18 to 12 BCE, and Cestius was a praetor and tribune of the plebs. And this was, of course, originally constructed outside the city walls of Rome. And shortly after it was constructed, Augustus made some laws that sort of limited the type of funerary monuments that you can have. And as you can see, it is clearly a pyramid. And people have speculated that Cestius might have been on campaign in Egypt and possibly even in Nubia and been inspired by his campaigns there to make this pyramid. And we can see that the shape of it is fairly similar to the Nubian pyramid shapes. Next, we have this very interesting, possibly portrait of Cleopatra in Herculaneum. And so this dates to the 1st century CE and was, of course, preserved, I guess, for the lack of a better term, by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79, which completely covered that city with ash. And we don't know for certain that this is a portrait of Cleopatra, but it certainly appears to be a portrait of a Ptolemy. And we do know that Cleopatra spent a good amount of time in Rome. So it is certainly possible that we have this portrait of Cleopatra. And this goes along with the earlier mosaic we saw, where we see Egyptian elements being brought into private spaces and decoration. Now, outside of Rome and outside of Italy, we also get Roman tourists at the Colossi of Memnon. So the Colossi of Memnon had this had a reputation for making musical sounds when it was struck by rays of the sun. And people would make these pilgrimages to the Colossi. And when they'd get there, they would write their names on the statues. And we might be shocked by this kind of behavior today, but for us, it tells us a lot about what people were thinking about the ancient past during the Roman period of Egypt. So there are 45 in total Latin inscriptions, graffiti written on these colossi. And here is just one example of an inscription that is there. In the 7th year of the Emperor Caesar Nerva Trajan Augustus Germanicus Dacius, Gaius Vibius Maximus, prefect of Egypt, heard Memnon on February 14th, once at 9, and once at 9:30 in the morning. So we see this appreciation and fascination really with ancient Egypt by the Romans in the Roman era of Egypt. So let's talk a bit about the Egyptian province during the time of Athenaeus, who was writing around this late 2nd and early 3rd century CE. So politically, during the 2nd century, the emperor began to permit bules or councils for metropoles. So what this tells us is that cities in Egypt were beginning to get a little more autonomy than they were previously allowed. And so in addition to this, we see that culturally, there is a continuation of cultural Hellenism among the upper classes. And this is a continuation from the Ptolemaic era after Alexander the Great. And we see this Hellenism continuing through these upper classes. And this also brings us to this sort of division between the two classes and two cultures in Egypt. So you have the city, who is the elite, and the Greek culture versus the country, the lower classes and peasants, and sort of Egyptian people living in that space. And so we have this division between these two groups, but we also do see a lot of cultural syncretism, which we will note during this talk. I'm just gonna take some tea. All right, so this brings us to the next part of our talk, which is, who is Athenaeus? Well, from the Suda, which was a 10th century encyclopedia, we know that he was from Naucratis, that he was a grammarian, and that he was alive at the time of Marcus Aurelius. And that's it. This is all we know about Athenaeus. We get no other information about his biography except for whatever we could sort of glean from the text, the Deipnosophistae. But he was from Naucratis. So let's talk a little bit about this city. So Naucratis was a trading station, and it dates back at least to the archaic era of Greece, if not even before then. And it declined in sort of popularity after Alexandria was established. And you can sort of see why. Alexandria is, of course, right on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, and Naucratis is down one of the channels of the Nile. We do have this very cool pottery sherd just to show how far back this Greek colony goes. This is a 6th century pottery shard, and we can see the epsilon sigma iota. So let's now turn to the Deipnosophistae. And my favorite translation of this title is the learned banqueters, but you might also see it as the dinner for philosophers, or the philosophers at dinner, something like that. There's multiple different translations of this. I like the learned banqueters because of a few reasons. Primarily, I think that the word banquet really gets at some of this reception of ancient Egyptian culture that we see in this text. In addition to this, we know that this text is a symposiastic text. And so this is based on Plato's Symposium, and Xenophon is another author who writes this type of literature. So they're dialogues where people are getting together, having wine, having dinner, and talking about philosophy, talking about morality, trying to achieve some sort of higher truth. Now, in the Deipnosophistae, we have a greater focus on food than you do in Plato's Symposium. In fact, many people have sort of colloquially called this text a cookbook. And there are a lot of really interesting descriptions of food and sort of recipes of food that you can find in this text. There also is a real theme of morality and self-control that comes through in this text. And we're going to look at that today and what that means for Roman era receptions of ancient Egypt. And so what this text can offer us is an insight into the educated and upper class elites in the early 3rd century, specifically in Egypt. So here's the plot of the Deipnosophistae. The plot centers around Athenaeus recounting to his friend Timaeus conversations that occurred at fictional dinner parties in Rome. Now, I've included this mosaic from the 5th century, and I think this mosaic is sort of intended to be how we're supposed to imagine this scene that Athenaeus is presenting to us. There are a bunch of people kind of all crowded into a room, eating and talking. And the talking really is the center focus of this text. In fact, there's so much talking, it would have taken days and days and days for this dialogue actually to have taken place. So here are a few notes on the manuscript tradition. This text is quite long. There are 15 books in total. But interestingly, books 1, 2, and part of book 3, we only have in Byzantine era summaries. So we don't actually have the text of Athenaeus. We just have the summaries of books 1, 2, and part of 3. The rest of the 15 books we do have. However, it was possibly a larger text originally. And here we have a manuscript from the 15th century of this text. So here are some of the characters that are at this dinner party. And there are a lot of characters. I could potentially have spent the entire hour just going through all of the different people who are invited to these dinner parties. But I wanted to focus on just a few of the interesting ones. So we have Laurenus, who is the host of this dinner party, and he's also a scholar. We also have Plutarch, who is described as a philologian, but Plutarch is, of course, a well-known biographer, and his biography on Antony is one of our biggest sources for Egypt right at the end of the Republic. And in addition to Plutarch, we have Galen, whose name you might recognize as being an early doctor, and he's described as a philosopher and physician. One of the members of the party who goes back even further, and I put CE on this slide, I intended to put BCE on this slide, is Democritus, who is a pre-Socratic philosopher. And he, of course, lived hundreds of years before these dinner parties took place. We also have an interesting character of Philadelphus from Ptolemies, who's described as a philosopher. And we don't have much other information about this person. And I can't help but wonder if this is a sort of nod to Ptolemy Philadelphus, who is also noted later on in this text as having moved philosophical works to the library at Alexandria. So I do think that this sort of enigmatic figure might in fact be a sort of subtle reference to Ptolemy Philadelphus. And we also have the figure of Alcides of Alexandria, who's described as a musician. And Alcides is another name for Hercules. So I can't help but wonder if there is a connection there as well. So here are two major themes that we're going to be talking about today. The first is food and symposia, or food and banquets, for perhaps a better word for this. And the second is cultivation of knowledge. So banquets in ancient Greek and Roman literature were hugely influential to Athenaeus. So the word symposium means to drink together. And as I've already mentioned, Plato and Xenophon were two ancient Greek authors who wrote symposia. And these texts were not just about banqueting and eating, but also philosophical texts. Now, in the Roman era, we have a sort of interesting development with convivia, which is the sort of Roman word for banquet. We have this text called the Satyricon by Petronius, and it is a satirical text, and it goes into great detail about this incredibly over-the-top dinner at Trimalchio's. So the Cana, the dinner of Trimalchio right here. And this dinner is so grotesque that it pretty much disgusts people to the point to where they actually can't partake in eating this at this dinner. And Trimalchio is this very boorish sort of figure who is really trying to show off his wealth, but really doing it in an over-the-top way. So one sort of quick story of this dinner is that a pig is brought out, and when the cook cuts into the pig, it looks like the pig hasn't been properly gutted. So it looks like all of the innards fall out, and everyone gets immediately disgusted and turns away. And then it's revealed that the innards are actually completely cooked sausages and that they're totally fine to eat. But the visuals of the innards of the pig have turned people off from eating. And so they're too disgusted to eat at this point. And these types of scenes happen continuously throughout this particular work. So Roman dinner, we get the Roman banquets as in this particular text as being over the top and maybe less philosophical and more about overindulgence. So we also have the cultivation of knowledge in this text, and over 700 ancient authors are referenced, and in total over 2,500 works, which most of which are no longer extant. So a lot of scholars have appreciated this text because it's almost like a clue to what would have been in the Library of Alexandria. We have so many different titles and even quotations from otherwise completely lost texts. So I wanted to highlight just a few of the ancient texts about ancient Egypt. So we have the Egyptian Iliad. We have a few different Egyptian histories. We have something called On Sandy Deserts by Clearchus, who was a student of Aristotle's school. And he also went to Bactria. So we potentially in this text, we're not only getting the history of Egypt, but the history of Bactria, which is modern day Afghanistan. We also have an interesting text called On Aphrodite, which is written by a person named Polycarmus of Naucratis. And Aphrodite has real connections to the city of Naucratis, which we'll talk about at the end of this talk. And so this text potentially would have given us insight into archaic era Egypt. And we lastly have history of things to be seen in Egypt. And I can't help but assume that this particular text would have included the Colossi of Memnon. I'm sure it did. So here are some considerations when we're looking at this text for evidence of what the Roman era Egyptians and people living in Roman era Egypt thought about the ancient Egyptian past. The first is that it is primarily Greek sources. So we're looking at the ancient Egyptian past through a Hellenistic lens. Next, it is an upper class perspective. So we're not getting much information about the lower classes. So here are the visions that I will focus on today. The first three are sort of the main visions, and that would be the ancient Egyptian kings, banquets, and wine. These are huge topics in this particular text that I think are worth going into to sort of understand how ancient Egypt is being presented in this text. But in addition to this, we also have a few smaller themes that I thought would be fun to talk about. We have tribute. We also have mummies and Egyptian gods. And we're going to end the talk with a discussion of Pre-Ptolemaic Naucratis. And here is a mosaic of the view of the Nile. So let's start by looking at the visions of Egyptian kings. So whenever a Ptolemaic era king is mentioned, he is always mentioned in reference to being the first, the second, the third, etc., king of Egypt. So in this quotation here, we see Ptolemy Philadelphus as being referred to as the second king of Egypt. And so this is interesting because it gives us this idea that the Ptolemies were the first of the Egyptian rulers. But this becomes a little bit of a problem when looking at the rest of the text, because we do see pre-Ptolemaic kings referenced in the Deipnosophistae. So we have two kings from the 26th dynasty who are referenced. We have Ahmose II, who was asked to provide one of his daughters to Cambyses for marriage. And we also get Psamtik I, who apparently wished to discover the sources of the Nile. And so we get these Egyptian kings referenced. We also get a couple of kings from the 30th dynasty referenced. So, and these are both really interesting because they're both looking at how these pharaohs or kings, as they're described in the text, are sort of making fun of people. So Teos apparently ridiculed Agesilaus, who is the king of Sparta. And he wanted Sparta to be an ally, but he did not, Agesilaus did not like being made fun of for being short. And so he did not support him, and Teos thus lost his kingdom. And we also get Nectanebo II referenced. And here we see Nectanebo making fun of Artaxerxes III for his dinner. So we get these other pre-Ptolemaic kings that are referenced in this work, but they're not provided with a number the way that the Ptolemies are. So how do we sort of put this together? Well, I think it's possible that what he is referring to is specifically that the Ptolemies were a dynasty, a Hellenistic dynasty. And this dynasty, he's connecting to Egypt without separating out the Greek pharaohs from the other Egyptian pharaohs. And what that tells us is that there's a continued effectiveness of Ptolemaic propaganda among Greek-speaking elites in the Roman era. And we know that the Ptolemies really worked to present themselves as Egyptian pharaohs in certain spaces. So things like the Raffia decree have Egyptian priests acknowledging what the Ptolemies are doing for them and trying to maybe present them as Egyptian pharaohs, even though they are from a Greek dynasty. And we also see Ptolemaic rule as Egyptian rule, which is different from how the Romans and the Persians are presented throughout this text. We don't get a sense that the Romans are kings of Egypt or that the Persians are kings of Egypt, but the Ptolemies are. And potentially there's an intentional sort of messing around with the timeline of the kings of Egypt to make it seem like the Ptolemies are actually the first kings, even when they're not. So let's talk a little bit about banquets in ancient Egypt. So we know that banquets were occurred both at funerals and at festivals. The oldest banquet scene is from the 6th dynasty, and banquet scenes became really common in tombs. And during the Middle Kingdom, we began to see more elaborate banquet scenes. And then by the New Kingdom, banquet scenes would include all of the friends and family of the deceased individual. And after the New Kingdom, these huge banquet scenes, like I've included on this slide, became much less common. So we get these visions of ancient Egyptian banquets in the Deipnosophistae. And so here's one quotation that describes an ancient Egyptian banquet. What Egyptian dinners were like, Protagoras shows in the first book of his Games at Daphne when he says, quote, "A third kind of dinner is the Egyptian, where no tables are placed besides the guests, but platters are carried around among them." Now, we do have plenty of banquet scenes that show people sitting at tables, but we do, in addition, get these banquet scenes like this one here that I provided for you, where people are in fact sitting on the ground and food is sort of being passed around and offered to them. So this does seem to be a sort of awareness of certain Egyptian banquet customs. We also see wine in ancient Egyptian banquets. And so here's a really great New Kingdom banquet scene where we have wine being served to the deceased individual, and the phrase "drink and make a happy day" is next to it. And in the Deipnosophistae, we also have this connection between banquets and wine. So we have, among Egyptians also, every kind of symposium was conducted with moderation in ancient times, as Apollonia, who has written on this subject, says. For they sat as they dined, making use of the simplest and most healthful foods and drinking only so much wine as would be sufficient to promote good cheer. So this is a pretty interesting passage, in part because it points to that theme of moderation that I mentioned earlier. The Egyptians here, and we'll see later, are presented as moderate drinkers. And this goes in contrast with certain types of Roman propaganda that you get from Plutarch, for example, when Plutarch talks about Antony and what Antony does in Egypt. So we get a really interesting sort of continued memory or reputation, I guess, of Egyptians and moderation. So let's talk a little bit about wine in ancient Egypt. So we know that wine was initially imported into Egypt, and the tomb of Scorpion the First contained 4,500 liters of resinated wine. And around 3000 BCE, Egypt began producing its own wine. And there was this really cool study that was done by Patrick McGovern that looked at ostraca from the New Kingdom. And from this ostraca, we can understand some of the functions of wine as well as the way that wine was treated. So some things that we can learn about the wine include the quality, which was described as either genuine, good, very good, or very, very good. We also get the region, and interestingly, the Western River was the most common region for wine production. And we also get the purpose of wine. And so these ostraca would have labels such as wine for offerings, or wine for taxes, or wine for merrymaking, or wine for a happy return, perhaps wishing someone well if they were setting off on a journey somewhere. And this purpose, the purpose of wine used in this way, can be seen into throughout the Ptolemaic period. So here is an example of an ostracon in the image from the late Ptolemaic era that is also a wine used for taxes. So I wanted to also bring up the Wag-Festival, which occurred during the first month of the inundation of the Nile. And it represented a rejuvenation of the vineyards. And there's some interesting pyramid texts that relate Osiris to wine. So we have, it is said that Osiris has come as Orion, Lord of wine, during the Wag-Fest. And we also know that wine was consumed as part of these festivals. I wanted to include this because there's this very, very long passage, and it was far too long to include in today's talk, that talks about a Ptolemaic era festival. And in this Ptolemaic era festival, we have a lot of Dionysus imagery. And so it seems that there is, among the Ptolemies, a synthesis of perhaps the Wag-Festival and appreciation of wine with Dionysus. And it's something that is in this text that so in Roman era Egypt, people are still remembering. So wine in Roman era Egypt continued to be produced. And here is that wine stopper seal that I mentioned right at the beginning. Now, as you can see, it has a cobra on it, which is of course the Urius symbol, the symbol for the pharaoh. And this particular wine stopper seal is from the 1st to 2nd century CE and was probably from the Fayum Valley. And we see, of course, the emperors all still using the urius. And here is on the right, we have a statue of one of the pharaohs from the 1st century who has that urius symbol. And so this wine stopper seal, it is hypothesized, was to indicate wine that was meant for the Roman emperor. Now, wine also had a really interesting role in Naucratis's hometown. So here is a wine stopper seal from Naucratis, which dates up to potentially the 2nd century CE in the British Museum. And the British Museum has found a lot of wine stopper seals from Naucratis from this time period, and has suggested that wine amphorae must have been sealed in Naucratis during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. And that would help explain why Athenaeus becomes so preoccupied with wine in his text. There is a bunch of information about wine, and it's possibly because his own hometown was part of the production, specifically the amphorae sealing, in his hometown. So here are some examples of Egyptian wine in the Deipnosophistae. We have, quote, but Hellenicus maintains that the vine was discovered first in Plynthene, a city of Egypt. Hence Dio, the academic philosopher, says that the Egyptians became fond of wine and bibulus. Now, this is so cool because we know, so first of all, we know that wine was not invented in Egypt, but we do know that wine has a very ancient history. And we know that wine specifically has an ancient history in Plinthine. There were archaeological discoveries, and I wasn't sure if I could actually post any of the images from these discoveries, so I just sort of posted the title, where we have information that viticulture was practiced in Plinthine back to the New Kingdom and up through the Ptolemaic period. So there's this really interesting memory of wine as being discovered and sort of invented in Egypt that we're getting in the Roman period. So essentially the Romans thought that wine came from Egypt, which is really, really fascinating. Now, we also get a really great wine hangover prevention cure. So that the Egyptians are wine bibbers is indicated also by the custom found only among them of putting boiled cabbage first on their bill of fare at banquets, and it is so served to this day. Many even add cabbage seed to all the remedies concocted against drunkenness. Now, cabbage was grown in ancient Egypt, and we get sort of an interesting connection in Aristotle as well. Aristotle is one of the only other places that predates this text that I could find in which we have a connection between cabbage and wine, and cabbage used as a hangover cure. But I again want to point out the theme of moderation and not overdoing it, and self-control. We have the Egyptians being presented here as people who do not want to overindulge in wine and who want to control how they act after imbibing wine. So I find that to be really fascinating. So we've gone over some of the big topics. So now I want to hit on some of the smaller topics that I think are still really interesting. So we get visions of an ancient Egyptian tribute to the Persian king. And so we from this sort of longer quote, we learn about a text called Tributes Paid Throughout Asia, which we no longer have. We also get Persian history, and we learn that salt and Nile water were sent to the Persian king. Now, this is super, super cool because there are these sculptural reliefs in Persepolis that depict tributes that were given by different people who were under the control of the Persian Empire. However, the tribute from Egypt is fairly badly destroyed. So we have this image here, which is really what all you can see of the Egyptian tribute, and it's just the little legs of a hippopotamus. So this text is supplying really helpful information because it's telling us what Egypt was supplying to the Persian Empire when Egypt was under Persian rule, what their specific tribute was. We also get probably one of my favorite quotes from this whole text, "Dead as an Egyptian mummy." And so we get these visions of Egyptian mummies. And of course, we know that Egyptians were still practicing human mummification from the Fayum portraits, for example. And I here include a mummy of a falcon. This particular text this section of the text is talking about salted fish. So mummies are being compared to salted fish in the Deipnosophistae. And this is a quotation from a now lost play of the Athenian playwright Sophocles, and the play was Phineas. So we get this sort of continued, throughout the Roman era sort of reference, and I think kind of an interesting and fun quotation, "Dead as an Egyptian mummy." We also get anti-zoomorphism. Now, I did not include, there is a much, much longer passage in the Deipnosophistae that is very anti-zoomorphic gods, but it contains a lot of animal cruelty, and I just thought that was going to be too much for a Sunday afternoon. So I went ahead and included a much more tame passage where we see a person named Timocles, who writes in the Egyptians, when in fact people who sin against those gods, whom all confess, don't pay the penalty straight away, who will be struck down by a mere cat's altar. So poor Bastet here is really being dragged through the mud, so to speak, by these Greco-Roman writers. And I think that that's sort of an interesting place, and it's one of the only places in the text where you see this not appreciation for Egyptian culture, but a real harsh judgment of Egyptian culture from the author. We also get visions of ancient Naucratis, and this is where I will be ending the talk today. And this is very, very cool. So we get in the text this story about the temple of Aphrodite and the importation of Cypriot art. So the quotation says, but in the 23rd Olympiad, which is in 688 to 685 BCE, Herostratus, a fellow countryman of mine who was a merchant and as such had sailed to a great many different countries, coming by chance to Paphos in Cyprus, bought an image of Aphrodite, a span high of very ancient workmanship, and came away meaning to bring it to Naucratis. So what is really, really cool is that there have been archaeological uncoveries of Cypriot art in the Temple of Aphrodite in Naucratis. And so here are just a couple of my favorites. We have a bear or baboon, which is dated back to the Archaic period. And we also here have a woman playing tambourine. And again, these are from the Archaic period. We're looking at the same period of time that this text is talking about. So, I mean, it's just so cool because we have this material culture that's kind of validating information that we're getting from this text. So after this scene, this section of text, the scene continues and we learn a little bit more about Herostratus's journey. And in this journey, we learn about the crown of the ancient city of Naucratis. Now, ancient cities, especially Greco-Roman cities, tended to have crowns that were used in things like festival parades. So if you wanted to send a representative to a festival in another city, you would send them with the city crown, and that crown would be paraded in order to represent your specific city. You also see crowns like this in Roman triumphal parades when the Romans were trying to demonstrate to the Roman citizens all of the different cities they conquered. They would show off these types of city crowns that all had sort of different leaves on them to represent some part of the city. And so here we have Athenaeus trying to figure out what the foliage is on the city crown of Naucratis. And he does this through this continued story of this merchant coming back from Cyprus. And he says, and the goddess that is Aphrodite, for she was kindly disposed towards the men of Naucratis, suddenly filled all the space near her with branches of green myrtle and diffused a most delicious odor over the whole ship. And then the sailors go on to being sick, and then they recover, and the sun comes out and they see Naucratis, and then Herostratus disembarks from the ship with this image of Aphrodite, and he also carries with him the green branches of myrtle, and he consecrates it and both of them in the temple of Aphrodite. So we have this continued vision of this pre-Ptolemaic era city of Naucratis. So I will now just end with a few concluding thoughts about the Roman era visions of ancient Egypt in the Deipnosophistae. First, we're getting a glimpse of Egypt beyond wealth and luxury, which is something that many other scholars have pointed out and looked at before. But the significance of Egypt isn't purely because of wealth and luxury. It also is because it has this incredibly ancient past that is something that is of interest to people in the Roman era. And we're also continuing to see that Romans are looking at ancient Egypt through a Greek lens. So they're not really understanding Egyptian history from an Egyptian lens, but through a Greek lens. And this is something that you see in other places in the Near East as well. So for example, in Persia, we also see the Romans sort of understanding ancient Persia through a Greek lens. And finally, we see that there is a desire to connect contemporary Roman era culture and practices to this pre-Ptolemaic Egyptian past. So connecting the act of banqueting, which is what is happening in the plot of this particular text, is something that goes back to ancient Egypt. And drinking wine with moderation is something that goes back to ancient Egypt. And so there's this desire to connect to this sort of really great archaic past. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed giving this talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Carly. It is fascinating. Let's see, we have, I believe, some questions. Please give us your questions. I have one comment from Jesse Forney, who says, interesting that there does not appear to be references to before the Nubian pharaohs, in other words, the 25th dynasty. Can you comment on that?
I think that I mean, that's really interesting. I think that we're looking at these Greek sources, right? So it's all coming again through this Greek lens. So I think what that points to is a potential, like an inaccessibility of knowing who these pharaohs were before the 26th dynasty. I think that information has been lost by this point in time from the Greek perspective.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
We have two compliments. Lorraine Stratikater says, wonderful talk. So does Yannikis Papadopoulos. Glenn Meyer asks, well, any description of the Egyptian Iliad mentioned in an earlier slide?
No, I wish that there was. No, I mean, you know, if you would like to email me, I can pull up the actual quotation, because I can't remember it off the top of my head. But it's just the Egyptian Iliad, which sounds so fascinating.
Yeah, I know.
It's such a frustrating thing to have lost. Yeah.
I would love to read that. Cynthia Smith asks, you mentioned animal cruelty and anti-zoomorphism during the Greco-Roman period. Was not there an increase of animal offerings during this period?
Animal offerings from Egypt or from Rome?
I don't know. That is the question from Cynthia. Cynthia, do you mean animal? Which do you mean?
Animal offerings in Egypt. That's a good question. I actually don't know if there was an increase of animal offerings in Egypt. I know that throughout the Ptolemaic period, there continued to be mummification of a lot of different animals and into the Roman period. And we also, you know, would of course need to have some sort of animal sacrifice for to indicate that Egypt was a province of Rome. That certainly would have occurred. But I don't know if there was an increase, but if somebody else knows if there was an increase, that would be a fascinating sort of thing to go down. Yes, I can put up the bibliography again.
Okay.
Let me do that.
That's from Sid. Okay.
Here we go. I can't see the questions now. So,
oh, okay. That's all right, because there have not been, another from Jesse. As Egypt became more Roman, Jesse believes there was.
There were.
Okay. A tenet of Lupercalia is animal sacrifice in a fire.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah. No, that could have been in Egypt. Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions for Dr. Paris? Anna Rumi asks, I'm a PhD student researching about Ptolemaic Egypt, particularly looking at their acceptance and inclusion in the Pharaonic tradition. She is asking for to connect. So
yeah, definitely send me an email. I'd love to talk more about this. the Ptolemies for me are just such an important sort of point of reference to Egypt for the Romans. So I would be happy to connect. We can give you my email if that's possible. Yeah.
Okay. Any more comments or questions? Oh, another from Glenn. Did the Romans recognize the flowering of Greek sculpture that arose from exposure to Egyptian sculpture?
I don't get the sense that they understood a lot of the connections, that specific they would have understood that specific connection. So my sense is no, probably not.